Okay, let's go back and look at a couple more verb frame scenarios. So we talked about kind of a lot of the different things that you get, focusing primarily on verbs having to do with events that involve changes of location, where things move through space. So that's a very, very basic sort of scenario. And other things can be seen as really kinds of metaphorical extensions of that. So if you talk about things that are changes of state, are very similar to changes of location. So when you go from one state to another, you're going from one place to another in a certain kind of way, right? So we could talk about being in a coma, where a coma is a kind of state, right? A state of mind, or being down in the dumps, or something like that, right? That we use the same locational vocabulary to talk about these things and often. And so it's a kind of extension of the same thing, but it's still, nevertheless, we can distinguish these things. And so if we have something like this, we have clearly a change of state, right? Well, I mean, there's a change of location. The brick is moving somewhere, right? But when we're focusing on what happens to the window, then it undergoes not a change of location as such. The pieces of it do in a sense, right? But that's really a change it goes from being in the state of whole to being in the state of broken, right? So that's a change of state. So and the semantics of that is that there's some changes of state are brought about typically by agentive actors, people doing things, or not always people doing things, but that's the prototypical scenario. Someone does something, and that results in a change of state. So that would be, there's lots of verbs like that, like kill and destroy and close the window, dry the clothes. The clothes are going from state of wet to state of dry. Yeah.
So is the window both location and?
Yeah. Right? Well, you could. People will do different things. They'll say different things. They'll say this is patient, right? But in the system that I'm using here, which is one that is based on is one kind of system. These things are defined in terms of an action, sub-event, someone does something, or someone does something to something, right? When there is a do something to person or thing, right, then that's what's characterized as the patient, right? And the patient can be also the thing that undergoes the change of state or change of location. So again, change of location is and change of state are both similar things, and so we can use the same terminology. We can say the undergoer of a change of state is the theme, right? And you'll see that there are reasons for doing it that way. There are cases where you have changes of state where there is no causing action that's part of the concept. And so therefore there is no patient, right? There's nobody is conceived of as doing something to it, but things can just simply change state. So these things can be distinguished. So then we have a kind of scenario like this. My brother broke his own window would have the verb break, and it would have in the lexical conceptual structure, the argument structure would be acting, causing, and become. So the act, cause, become, go. So the difference really between change of location and change of state basically boils down to whether or not there is a go or a become, assuming that those are like primitive notions. So the things here, I should explain this a little bit here. The things in capital letters, like cause and become and act and go, are thought of in this system as being primitive operators. Those are things that are just there, and they're part of universal conceptual semantics, and they're invariant. And then the things in italics that are capitalized, like broken, is a more complex concept that could be broken down. But we're just taking a shortcut here because we don't really care about what the details are of broken, right? So that's a kind of thing to keep in mind here. And then otherwise there's just some kind of formula for putting in x's and y's, for putting in the arguments and relating them to each other. So x acts on y. Because of this, or this causes y to become broken, is the basic concept. And here there are only two arguments, right? And that would be one thing that kind of distinguishes changes of location from changes of state. In changes of state, there are typically only two arguments at most, right? The agent that causes something to happen and the patient theme, combined roles that undergoes that change of state. Because you could actually do this as, you could do it with go, right? Causes y to go from not broken to broken, right? That would be another way of doing it, but it's y that's doing all of that, right? There's no other place. And you don't ever specify well, you kind of do, you specify it in the verb itself, right? The concept broken is in the verb. But in any case, so we have an agent, which is a DP, and a specifier. That's just default mappings, and the patient is in the object slot or the complement of the slot, and that happens to also be the theme. So there's a binding relationship in the conceptual structure, and that means that if we have these two arguments that are arguments of different predicates in that lexical conceptual structure, but they're identical, they have the same reference, then there can only be one instantiation of that in the syntax. One DP or whatever will be doing the work. Then we also have, it's kind of interesting because you think of it as, you would ordinarily think of these things as being transitive verbs. They have a subject and an object, and that's true, but it's important to recognize that the semantics isn't the same. There are some cases where we know that, right? There's some cases where you have changes of location, changes of state, but you also have subclasses of all of those kinds of verbs. We looked at changes of location that are goal-oriented, that are source-oriented, that are theme-oriented. You also have verbs of creation that look like they're just kind of the same thing because we boil it all down in the grammatical system to subject and object at some level. Those are the grammatical relations. But here, if you look at verbs of creation, like with create or write or paint or draw, what you can say, what did I do? You can say what my brother did was create this statue, that's fine. But you can't say things like what my brother did to this statue was created, right? It's just weird, right? Because the action is, the person is doing something, and something that didn't exist comes to exist. So it's just conceptually impossible to think of it as being the case that something has to be there before you can do something to it, right? So it's a kind of just a different thing to just pay attention to. So my brother created this statue, would have the same kind of syntactic structure, but it would simply not have for the action part of the sub-event, the agent does something, but you don't have the to something part of it. And so therefore, no patient role at all. So here's another case where the theme role can be distinguished from the patient role. So we have the agent being the specifier, the theme then, so patient or theme, both of those, the default realization. That's not always the case, but the default realization we could say is that the theme is a DP complement. Agent is DP specifier of the head. The theme is a DP complement of the head. So
that you embrace.
If we look at something like that, here we have a case where it's kind of weird to think of this as Allison doing something, right? It's more like something happened to Allison, right? Was Allison have any conscious control over that? In order to do something to someone or something, there has to be an element of volition or an element of control. And there's a whole class of verbs, of intransitive verbs that work like this. So die, expire, mature, grow up, all kinds of things like that. Decay, melt, where the ice melts. The ice isn't doing anything, and sometimes it's not in control of that at all. There are circumstances that are causing that to happen. It's not the ice itself that is doing something to cause the change of state, but these are all changes of state, right? So here's another case where we have changes of state without an agent role, just a theme role. And you can do this again with verbs of, so another kind of thing that's interesting and that we need to be aware of and keep in mind when we're looking at the relationship between meanings and syntactic structure, because that's what we're doing here, right? We're going into some depth about the nature of the meaning. But as we do that, we're isolating particular recurring scenarios and recurring roles and identifying the relationship between those roles and the syntactic structure. So if we have this, my brother broke his own window, we have an agent-patient theme scenario. But if we have something like this, where there's no one doing anything, then we can conceive of that. It probably is the case that we know at some level that something caused that, but we have no idea what it was, right? There was some force that must have caused that, yeah.
But that's not true of all the verbs in the class, that first class.
No.
Like you can't say destroy.
Right. So there are sort of two classes of these things, of these verbs that involve changes of state, and it's also true for changes of location. You can get two different types. So one type is if you take as you see, I didn't list all of the ones that were on the first list. Die, for example, is only intransitive. You can't say that someone died that person, right? Or something died that person, right? So that's purely, so there are verbs like this that are purely intransitive, and then there are other ones like break, and there's a whole slew of these that have the same form. There's nothing marking them as being different. There's no derivational morphology that says go from one to the other. There is in some languages, by the way. There are languages that have systematic morphological relationships between one type and the other. So you have the same root. You have a root that means something like die. Very common scenario. You have a root that means something like die. You have a morpheme that goes on it that means now you're transitive and you mean cause to die. Right? That's a very common sort of thing to happen. You get that in English to some extent with things like enable. But the way it works in English is typically that the causative morpheme goes on an adjective. So it's doing two things. We have able, which is an adjective, and enable means cause to become able, right? So it both turns an adjective into a verb, or sometimes it can do that with nouns into verbs, right? And also adds that action event, the action sub-event, the causing action. But these, so you want to say then that there are verbs that have different subtypes. The verbs that can go into different semantic scenarios. Okay, and then the way that we account for this is that, and this is the thing that is possibly a new idea here. The idea is that we have the one version of break has a lexical conceptual structure like this, simply why become broken, right? And in that case, we only have the thematic role, but we have at the same time general principle that says, well, if you're a theme, then you are a DP complement. And so, therefore, we'll put the theme in the complement position and then say that it moves up into the subject slot. So it doesn't need to go through the VP specifier slot. There's no VP specifier. It's simply not there. But the underlying, so what we're saying is that the underlying syntactic position for this and the grammatical relation, the underlying grammatical relation is object. But on the surface, it's subject because English has a constraint to the effect that clauses have to have subjects. And when they don't have one of the things that you can do is move a DP from somewhere in the structure, and it could be from various places. And so it's a kind of interesting thing. And that's what we're going to be looking at, is what are the possibilities for movement of DPs through the structure. Now, it would be possible, of course, to say that in the case of the window broke, that, well, it's a subject, but it happens to just be the theme. That would be okay in general. There's no problem with that. But it turns out that if you look across languages at cases like this, there is there's an abundance of evidence for treating those as having underlying direct objects, that they're complements of the V underlyingly. So, and I'll come back to this, right? But it's because it's one of the big ideas in generative grammar. This is one of a proposal that goes back to early days and continues to be adhered to, the hypothesis that there are some subjects of intransitive clauses that are underlying objects. So we have the idea that we have all of the arguments of any head are realized internal to the projection of that head. So if we have two arguments like with break, then it's realized underlyingly. At the underlying level, you put into the tree, you build a tree like this, and then other things may happen to move things around. So that's the transformational idea within generative grammar. And then you have the idea that the X-bar theory, verbs had VPs, they have complements, they have specifiers, they have adjuncts. The specifier and complement positions are where the arguments go. They have to go into one of those positions. And you can then have this same structure across categories with all of the same pieces being able to go. So we have just the same structure here in something that's just a PP, at least underlyingly, right? So this would be in a case like I want him all the way out of my life. I can't imagine him all the way out of my life, where we have a subject of. What's interesting here is that the subject is the subject of nothing that is a verb, right? Just out of my life, it's a PP, right? But it still functions as a unit in terms of its syntactic behavior, and Maybe on the surface it's not really a PP, it might be something else. But at some level, in terms of the argument structure, out has two arguments, right? Or can have two arguments, because it specifies a relation between two things, a place and a thing that moves out of that place, right? It's really a kind of verb concept. And you can turn prepositions into verbs often, not always, but like you out someone, right? Cause them, so you can do the same kind of, you can turn it into a causative verb by simply making it be one, coercing it into the causative verb frame. So we have the same thing, right? We have heads, complements, specifier position, the arguments go in those positions, and we have adjuncts as well. And the PPs would only allow a fairly limited range of adjuncts, maybe, right? But there are some that you can do, right? And then you could also do the same thing with NPs. So Tom crazy worrying about me would be, where we have worrying as a noun, would be a possible, in this case it's quite clear that you can't just leave it like that, and that NP alone isn't complete. You have to build it up into a DP at some level, but in terms of the underlying structure, we can say that it has a structure like this, because worrying has two arguments. Actually, we didn't do this one, but worry wouldn't be a change of state, right? It wouldn't be a change of location. It wouldn't be a caused change of state or change of location or anything like that, right? And these are harder to sort of unpack the semantics for, because verbs like this, right, like worry and like and love and hate, but we have lots of them, right? Verbs of emotion or cognitive experience or psychological experience, right? There's a ton of those. And what we typically then say is that, well, they have an experiencer argument, that's typical terminology, or cognizer in some cases, or emoter, whatever. You can make up whatever terminology you want. But you can sort of, because these behave in similar ways, you can abstract away from the particular, whether it's an emotion or a cognitive state or whatever, and say there's someone that experiences that. There's an animate being involved. So that would be experiencer. And then what you call the other thing, people just usually they just go, I don't know, whatever. We'll call it theme. So that's a very typical scenario. And then theme becomes even more vague as to what it might mean. Some people would call it stimulus. There's an experience that must have been caused by something at some level. The thing that stimulates the emotion would be, what is the other argument? So there's different terminology that can be used. But again, you have the same basic structure, you can say, right? And so that would be universal, you might say. Languages would differ only with respect to the orderings of the particular elements. And you could have adjuncts and so forth. And then going back to this idea of movement, you would have functional projections, typically. We talked about that already. And the functional projections would provide places for specifier movement would be one kind of thing that happens, right? Specifiers of phrases typically move into the specifier position of the functional shell, where the functional shell is giving you not these kinds of, notice that in the VP shell, the main elements are things with considerable conceptual content. The functional projection would have these grammatical things, the for and the to, that don't have, at some level, don't have any conceptual meaning at all. They're just part of the grammatical glue, stuff that you need in English. This is all English-specific morphology that's telling you things like I'm a non-finite clause. There's no tense here to worry about. And whatever tense you want to put on me conceptually comes from a higher verb. It doesn't come from me. And the for, which is just saying, hey, I'm a complement clause that has non-finiteness, right? And then the specifier of the VP moves up into that position. And then there's the idea of why that happens and how much of it happens is something that varies a good deal over the history of the theory. One idea that's fairly recent and that continues to be used is that the reason for movement can be that, this is one idea. The category I has a subject feature that needs to be, the terminology, I don't know why, Chomsky just made this crap up one day, right? He woke up one day and said, I'm going to change all the terminology. And he says, we check features. And so trees would have, the syntactic trees would have, I've talked about this before, there would be grammatical features that would be associated with nodes. And those grammatical features that can be invisible, right? They don't necessarily have to have a morphological reflex. The minus finite part of this does have a morphological reflex because that's what to is by its very nature, but there's nothing phonological that says, oh, my meaning is I have to have a subject, right? So this is an abstract feature. Part of that would be part of universal grammar would be the claim that that's part of what I does. The I node in a tree can have the subject feature, and that subject feature, because it's abstract, needs to be checked, is the idea. So we can put a little check up there and say, it's been checked. Everything's cool. It's okay to pronounce the sentence because the subject value has been checked off in some sense by the presence. It's validated that that subject notion is there. So that's kind of a weird thing in a way, but in another way it makes sense. At some level, this is just a mechanism for having it be the case that there is movement. So you get to keep your basic principles, the principle that there's X bar theory, and that arguments are put into the tree across languages in those slots, and that's what you get. And then you have, to get the surface structures that may differ from language to language, you have differing kinds of features that force movement or keep movement from happening. Okay, so that's, and then there's also the notion of case assignment. So there's various kinds of features that you can have then that need to be checked. So you could also say the complementizer for has an accusative case feature. What we're doing here is explaining or attempting to give not explaining at some level, but give an account of why it is that the subject in this construction is going to be accusative or in the object form or the non-subject form, whatever you want to call it, if it's a pronoun, right? So you would have, for him to really break something, it would be bad. You would embed this under something like all kinds of cases, like it would be bad for him to break something, right? And we would get the him there. But the idea here is that that would always be, there would always be an accusative case feature. And in the case of most DPs in English, if they're not pronouns, then they could be either accusative or nominative or whatever, right? Because there's no morphological reflex of that. So it's free to be accusative, and therefore that can be checked off. But critically, if you had something like him in there, him would have necessarily the accusative feature, and it would be sanctioned to go in there by being checked. So that's the basic idea. and here we've got another idea that that I've talked about a little bit, but I'm going to take a little bit further, is that you can have, in addition to features that are abstract, you can have actual meaning elements that are abstract. You can have things like, and then the kinds of things that you would get would be things like be and have, and later on we'll put in things like that were, a lot of those things that were in the lexical conceptual structure can be put into the tree. And then eventually what happens in the theory is that we move toward a version of the theory where lexical conceptual structure, those meaning parts, are really just parts of the tree. And so you don't have to have them separated out as different things. So things like cause and become and go, there are reasons, there are arguments that you can use to justify putting those things in the tree. And here the idea is that that by having a D node here, we can motivate the categorization of these kinds of small clauses. This is small clause structure, right? Where it looks on the surface like it's just subject and PP. But when we looked at this earlier, we saw that there was lots of evidence for these things actually being considered to be DPs. They have the distribution of DPs. They go in slots where only DPs are sanctioned. Prepositions otherwise only sanction, or this preposition with, only sanctions DPs. So we can have it be the case that it is one of those. But how we can do that, if we're going to put in empty nodes, it's better in a way for them to have some kind of content. And the content here would be equivalent semantically to the content of B, which isn't much anyway, right? But there is some kind of content there. And so we can say then that we get with him all the way out of my life, I'll be better off. That's the kind of construction that we're talking to. So again, you have for him to be all the way out of my life would be one kind of thing where you have, in that case, you get an I node 2, and that's going to force a certain kind of overall construction. And it's going to have a certain distribution. But here we get a D node that we can say is the verb be, but not verb. The determiner instantiation of the concept be. And because it's a determiner, it cannot have any of the morphological stuff that make up regular verbs, right? So it's not really, it's like, it's all you're saying at some level is that a verb can come, we know that break can come in, there's two different kinds of break, you can do different things with it. You know that things like bag can go in and out of noun and verb, right? Here, the case is just that B can switch in between categories and be in the D category as well as the V category, but that's obscured and at some level not obvious, or maybe it can be nothing but a hypothesis that can't be proven at some level, right? Because it's obscured by the phonological emptiness of the thing. But if we're going to have features like case and accusative case and subject and stuff like that, well, then you could just as well have stuff that has semantic content of some kind. So then the reason for movement here is we could say that the empty D, then once we've done that, right, and say that we've got these empty nodes, they can have case features, just like anything else. And we could say that that empty D node, that B determiner has an accusative case feature that gets checked with the element in that slot. We can't, and you see what the game here is a little bit tricky, right? Because you can't say that you can't say that there's a subject condition in DPs, because there clearly isn't, right? That's not the case in general. So, but there is a kind of regularity. When there appears to be an empty D that has a certain kind of semantic content, then it does, in fact, have to have a subject. And that could be by virtue of some kind of mechanism like this. But again, this is just spinning out a story in order to account for the facts at some level. And we recognize that. But then, again, like we looked at before, you can have cases like this where worrying about me, Tom, crazy, worrying about me can't stay that way, but it can be fixed if we've got the noun worrying by putting in a D that actually does have some semantic content and that has a meaning like a really vague meaning like have, like the auxiliary have or the very conceptually bleached have, and then you get cases like this, right? So it's the same thing. We could say that there's a kind of checking that has to take place with these verbs, because verbs typically do have accusative case. Verbs that get instantiated as D in order to give us the functional projection that we need have different case features. In this case, the Z, we could say, has genitive case feature that has to be checked. And it gets checked by virtue of being in the specifier slot, because the rule for case checking would be heads can check the case of their specifier and complement positions. So it's kind of like the concept of arguments, right? Arguments can be in specifier and complement positions, but case things can happen without there being an argument relation at some level, so depending on what the scenario is. Okay, so then when we have that, then we can go back to this case of break and look at the story that has been given for things like this. And this goes back like most things. The case assignment stuff is relatively recent in theory. Doesn't really come to be until Chomsky dreams it up in the 80s. But it's something that endures. This is another idea that endures, that goes back to the early 70s, owing to David Perlmutter, who was a student of Chomsky's in the late 60s, and his professor at MIT, Paul Postel, who was another genius. So you had people back then that were geniuses. They were all getting together. There were people from Harvard and MIT, and all of the people that were really into language and were good at this stuff were together in some kind of big festival of syntax, and you got lots of really bright people there. They were also, from what I understand, smoking a lot of pot and stuff. But not David Perlmutter, I don't think. But and then they're the ones that come up with this idea that you can have verbs that have underlying objects that move into subject positions. And then Mark Baker was another genius that was a student of Chomsky's in the 1980s, and another one of the people that had huge influence on the field of in the whole field of linguistics. Perlmutter and Postel, by the way, they went off and created their own theory that they called relational grammar, that got rid of phrase structure trees and just looked at things looked at clause structure in terms of relations like subject and object and indirect object and things like that. And so they elaborated a whole alternative theory that allowed them to account for much of the same kind of stuff. But Mark Baker comes along and actually building on ideas of Perlmutter and Postel, proposes that there are universals about how thematic roles are are related to tree structures, and one of them would be the themes, no matter what, are stuck into the complement position. And that's based on lots of evidence. I'm going to go through the classic evidence for this from Perlmutter and Postal in a minute. But the idea then is that you would have a lexical conceptual structure like this for break, and for one version of break, right? So we have that guy really broke something. The agent is DP, the patient is DP by complement by default, and then there's a movement that occurs. But then you can also have just a complement, and it would just become broken, right? So this would be break 2. There's break 1 and break 2. And it's stuck into the complement slot, but you still need it to be the case that the subject you've got two different forces. Themes have to be objects, they have to be complements, but you also need to have a subject, so it moves up into that slot automatically. So one kind of argument for this, the kind of best argument for this story, comes from Italian. And what happened was that, and the account of this is given in work that was published, the full work where this idea was elaborated was published in 1989. But the idea was out there, and everybody was smoking this stuff, metaphorically, in the early 70s. The idea here is you've got, if we take in Italian, if we have something like I Mariani hanno fondato la nave, something like that, right? With a bad English accent, right? The sailors have sunk the ship, is that what you say? Have sunken? No, have sunk the ship, right? Or sunken. Which one is it? Could be either one. Sunk? And you've got, it's sort of fairly straightforward. So there's the auxiliary verb there is in the present tense form, and it has a feature about its subject. It says, I have to have a third plural subject. Because this is the verb avere, that in Italian has a bunch of different forms. It has the form a, right? Ano. What else? I? Huh? Avete. It has a bunch of different forms, right? And here it's in a form that says, oh, I'm present tense, and my subject has to be third plural subject. It has to be third plural. But the meaning that I get from this is sort of like English, right? It's not, the meaning of the whole thing is going to be past tense. Because this construction, present tense verb, present tense auxiliary, have, plus past participle. So I'm an auxiliary, just like English, right? I'm an auxiliary that has to have a past participle form. This is stuff that goes across the Indo-European languages, right? That you indicate either past tense or some kind of notion like English where you have the past perfect or whatever you call it, right? Whatever the English construction is, right? That is built on the verb have plus the past participle of the verb. Some languages take that and completely obliterate the synthetic past tense form. So Italian has a form that would be like broke, so break, broke, but you don't use that in ordinary conversation. It's a kind of a literary thing, right? Because this is what you do instead. So the have past participle thing just came in and took over. Same thing happened in French, for those of you who know French. But it didn't happen in Spanish or Portuguese or other languages. So, but a very common sort of construction, and so we would have a lexical conceptual structure like this. So affondare would be a causative transitive verb. The sailors did something to the ship. What they did was make it go under the water, right? Which we could just put with become sunk. Right? There's a change of state. Again, but then notice here too, right, that you're kind of change of state, but it's a change of state that also entails a change of location at some level, right? Okay. And then we look at when you get the have auxiliary. This is what we're going to focus here on, the fact that Italian allows you to have two different auxiliaries. And guess what they are? Have and be. Just like in that, and so you know that idea that auxiliary elements, functional elements, that you stick into the clause in these functional shells are going to be the most common things are have and be. Those are when you have overt auxiliaries. Okay, so we have the women ate the spaghetti. We have a transitive. We have subject and object, right? And whenever you have that situation, subject and object, then the auxiliary verb, and you can see it changes its form depending on whether you have singular or plural, whether you have, and it would be that it would change if you had first person subject and so forth, right? The boys gave everything to the men. We got hanno dato. And then you can also have cases like this where we've got the students have studied chemistry at Oxford. Is this okay? Can you say this? Yeah. I think I might have made this up. I don't remember. But presumably it's possible to do this, right? And you get anno, but then you can also get an intransitive version of that, and then you still get anno. So the intransitive verbs will have avere, the have auxiliary as well, in many cases, but not in all cases. But here, if you look at this, what is the semantic role of the students here? Did the students do something? Have the students done something? Yes, they did something. They're actors. There's some kind of agent role here. And in that case, essentially, with an intransitive verb, you're going to get avere. So we have a lexical conceptual structure like this. X acts, giving you an agent role, and that means that the argument X needs to be instantiated by a DP in the specifier position. That's part of universal grammar according to Mark Baker's theory. Thematic roles are sufficient in the default case, at least, to give you the structures. And it would be the case with lots of the women ate, the boys worked, you got the students ran the Boston Marathon, the students ran in the park, but if we go back to this one, where we have sunk, we have the verb affondare, to sink, and we get rid of the agent argument, we can get the concept of the ship sank, right? And that's possible in Italian just like it is in English. The ship sank, but in this case, we're going to get, so we have theme is, if following this idea, the theme is the DP complement or the object by default. And then the auxiliary that we get is not have, but a form of be. So it's literally the ship is sunk with the auxiliary essere in the third person, and notice that's in the third person singular subject form. But then we have to do something else. So there's sort of two things that go on here. Because there's another rule to make, like life isn't hard enough learning Italian. You have to make it, in this case, It has to be that the form of the past participle shows gender agreement with the subject, which would be kind of the same thing as you would usually get gender agreement in languages where you have subject, verb is, and then the predicate that goes with it would be, and the adjective that goes with it would be in an agreeing form. Here, it goes from affondato. Was affondato for the nave? So third singular masculine nave requires no, la nave is feminine, right?
Feminine.
Yeah. But the sailors, it didn't matter, right? If it's the sailors sunk the ship, sink is not going to change its form no matter what you do. It only changes its form when you have essere as auxiliary. Okay, so that's sort of what the basic facts are. The perfect auxiliary is essere, be, there's a rule. If the I node checks its person features with a DP, we're going to give a fairly elaborate rule here because we're going to look at some things and say, oh, wow, that's crazy. But there's a systematic, this is systematic, right? When the I node checks its person features, third plural, subject, whatever it is, right? It's worried about the person features. When it checks it with a DP that is not contained, that doesn't have a trace in the specifier of VP position. So now we're starting to, but all of these moves that we've made to have subjects go in VP specifier slot and objects go in object slot are going to come together in Italian to give us a neat account of what appear to be rather complex facts. So the I node will check its person features with something in the object slot in many cases, right? Underlyingly, something that occupies that slot. And then in some cases that DP will move up into the specifier slot. And that will actually, it's kind of irrelevant that it moves there. And in fact, in Italian, you could do it without having it move there, right? In fact, that actually might be the default, right? You would say probably, è affondata la nave, right? That would probably be more, you could do it either way, right? But it would be perfectly natural to do it the other way, right? And so there's another piece of evidence, right? That, and in some languages it would be, and in some cases, with some verbs like this, it would be highly preferred to have it after the verb and have nothing at all in the subject slot. Okay, sorry. I usually put the ringer on. In Brazil, in a classroom, if that happens, the professor just stops and has the conversation. It's kind of crazy. All right. It agrees in number and gender with the DP complement. And then we get, the same thing with a bunch of verbs, right? So here's one where, remember we talked about there are two kinds of intransitive verbs? Affondare is a verb that can be transitive, and it can be intransitive. And when it's intransitive, it's the theme that shows up as the subject, right? Or that is the only thing that's there. But with the verb, what is it? What's the infinitive from die? Morire, right? That one can only be that way. It's like English. There's no transitive version of that, but you nevertheless get essere there. So the donna è morta. And then in these other cases where you have things like break, in Italian, break can be both transitive and intransitive. And in those cases, what Italian likes to do is to also mark that with this morpheme C. So there's a whole bunch of these verbs that are transitive and the intransitive version. Affondare doesn't work like that, right? Affondare doesn't have the C on it. So some of them do have the C and some of them don't. But this whole class of things like that, you get the auxiliary essere. Here's one that doesn't have transitive. This is only intransitive. Fallen. So an angel has fallen is what you would translate that in, or an angel fell, right? But it's with essere, right? So in all of those cases, you would have the object, the subject of the clause is, under this hypothesis, is underlyingly the object. And that's going to give you an account of a bunch of things. Now, here's a case that another one of the puzzles of Italian, and this one also is something that shows up in Spanish. The have be thing no longer shows up in Spanish, but it used to in some version if you go back to Old Spanish. In French, you get the same thing, but the rules for when you use the be verb for the past tense and when you use the have verb are different than in Italian. So this is something that you find across the Indo-European languages, but they will differ with respect to what the semantic and grammatical conditions are under which you choose one or the other. If you go back to Old English, you'll find the same thing. And that survives in Dutch and in other Germanic languages, but in English it's been virtually completely obliterated, the distinction between be and have. So here's another case here, and what's interesting about this is that we have the verb like, and we've got something that means the students liked the music, but in the subject of clause slot, what we have is what could arguably be said to be a PP, because it's, who knows, right? I made up some story about when that preposition goes on, gets glommed on to the article, then it's really a DP, maybe, right? But we don't want to do that for Italian because it's not going to work. Our story won't work. And we know, actually, that in those cases, it doesn't always glom on to something. It's only when you have the determiners, the articles, and some other cases, right? So here we have li studente. The li part is the definite article. But there's an a that gloms onto that, and the a is to. So we've got something that is semantically like the preposition to in English. And all this stuff about glomming on, the to thing gloms onto stuff in English as well, right? It's not clear. The writing system says you're all glommed together, right? And phonologically, there is some kind of glomming that goes on there, but it's not clear how much of that goes on all the time. In any case, we have something that we're going to say is a PP, and we're going to want to do this because it means to the students, and PPs can be things that you have. Okay, so we have a lexical conceptual structure like this. X likes Y. Notice that there's not really anything you put there, right? These kinds of verbs that are about emotional or cognitive states are they don't have any of this stuff like act and become and go, and right, you can't put any of that stuff in there. It's just like, right? But it has two arguments, an X and a Y, and then there's going to be you want to say for Italian for this verb, and there's a class of verbs like this, right? It's not just piacere. There's other ones that work like this. That its subject, the thing that has to be the subject of the clause, or the subject of the VP even, right, is what we're going to say, right? The subject is a prepositional phrase, a plus DP. And then the experiencer is the thing that's put in the subject note. So here we've got, actually, that's kind of interesting, right? Because on the surface, it looks like you've got an indirect object PP for the experiencer. But there's good reason to say that it's really the subject here. Then this like verb in Italian is just like English at some level, right? It's just there's a kind of cosmetic difference in that you get, and then this phenomenon, by the way, is something that you find across languages. It's a kind of very common thing to have what is often called dative subjects. because this to preposition, it can be considered to be dative in some sense, right? Where dative is prototypically the thing that is used to mark recipients in transfers of possession and experiencers in cases where you have cognitive or psychological states. So that's something that happens across lots of languages. And the analysis of this is made difficult by the mismatch between the morphological structure of the subject and its behavior in the clause. And so in this case, you could do this either way, right? You could say, I guess, right, la musica è piaciuta agli studenti. You could do it either way, but this way is kind of preferred, isn't it? Where you put the...
It's common, more common, but...
You could do it either way, right? So you've got these kinds of, subject properties for that experiencer. And, but nevertheless, you've got, so the theme is, but this would follow, right? If we say that with like, you have an experiencer and a theme, and that would work perfectly fine for English, right? I like the books. I is the experiencer goes in the specifier slot. The books is a theme. It goes in the object slot. And, that's all pretty cool. We could say that all languages always do this, right? And that's one of the hypotheses, right? That these verbs are the same across languages. There's only cosmetic differences at some level based on having different grammatical features and different rules or whatever. So the experiencer just happens to be a PP that goes in the specifier slot. The PP specifier, the VP moves to the specifier of IP slot simply to check the subject feature in I, we could say, right? There's a subject feature in I just like there is in English, and most languages you would have that. And so something goes there if you've got overt DP, if you've got overt arguments. And so that goes there for that reason. But then you get this situation, right, where the verb agreement, the person features, are actually checked with the object, not with the thing in the subject slot, right? Okay, so that's fine. We've seen that can happen anyway. We know that, or actually this is a good reason to say that it's possible in Italian to have the so-called subject agreement not be with the surface subject, but rather with some other thing. And the constraint is, basically, that if I'm a verb or an auxiliary and I have to agree with something, what am I going to agree with? I'm going to agree with a DP. I'm never going to want to have a PP. And you can look across languages. It works this way in Icelandic. It works this way in Germanic languages. It used to work this way, by the way, in Old English. The verb like worked this way with a dative experiencer and a nominative theme, and the verb agreed with the nominative thing. So it was just like Italian at some point. Because verbs just don't want to ever agree in general with PPs or dative case mark things. They want to agree with things that don't have, for whatever reason. And so you've got that, and then it falls out that the past participle agrees in gender and number with that, and that the auxiliary is essere, because the auxiliary is going to be essere whenever we have a simple rule. The auxiliary is going to be essere whenever the verb agreement is checked with something that is not, with a DP that is not in the specifier of VP slot, that doesn't have a trace there, that didn't originate there. Or you could look at it when the verb agrees with the thing that is underlyingly in the complement slot, the DP in the underlying complement slot, whether it's both on the surface or not, then you get essere B. what was I doing here? So here we have the sailors have sunk the ship. In this case, you see that we've got X acts on Y. X is the actor, therefore the DP and the subject in the specifier VP slot. And the verb is not going to agree with the object thing in this case, right? The verb is going to agree with the thing in the DP that's in the subject of clause slot, which is also the thing that comes from the specifier of VP slot, right? So when you unfold the whole package, you can account for this whole complex array of different possibilities that you get, and when you get SAD and when you don't. So we've got that sort of situation here, but I guess what I want to show here is that there's another phenomenon that will be explained by this whole theory. So this is kind of the way that you build theories and build analyses of constructions in language. So what Perlmutter's genius was actually was to not only see that you could account for essere and avere, the difference between those, but you can also account for a slew of other things, including the past participle agreement and this phenomenon, for which there was no solution up until that point, the phenomenon known as ne-cliticization. So there's a thing in, there's a particle that you can put on the auxiliary verb in Italian, or on the main verb when there is no auxiliary verb, that is just this little thing ne, and it means of them, or something like that, right? It's the partitive clitic is what it's called. And you don't have anything like this in English, so it's kind of hard to point to this thing. You don't have it in Spanish. You have it in French, but it would have the form E, with just a Y, for those of you who know French. So here we have the sailors have sunk two, and actually this is probably, I think, one of the stories is that ne is a pronoun that is down inside that DP, because all you've got left is the numeral there, right? And you've got a kind of ellipsis. But the ellipsis is related to the ne. And so you get the meaning because the ne, but the ne is on the auxiliary, right? It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. But the meaning you get is that the sailors sank two of them. You could say that when the context is already giving you something whereby you could put in a pronoun to begin with, right? So it's kind of like you've got a pronoun there and an ellipsis going on at the same time, right? Just like in English, you say, well, the sailors sank two. Or you could say they sank two of them, right? In Italian, you can't say the two of them. You put the ne on the verb instead, and you do ellipsis in combination. Okay, so le donne ne ha mangiato molto. You can also do it like this, where you have, so we have the women ate a lot of it. Right? Say this, read the sentence for me.
La donna ne ha visto due.
And so we have all these cases where we have transitive verbs. The boys have given a lot of it to the men. Is that good? And then if we do it with, go back to this case where we have study. Two students have studied at Oxford. You can't say due ne hanno studiato a Oxford, right? So you can't do it when the DP is the subject of the clause that you're trying to relate the ne to, is the key thing, right? So, and you could say this also. You can also put the subject after the verb. So in this case, you have to have the subject after the verb to make this work. But you still hanno studiato due studenti a Oxford. You can't say ne hanno studiato due Oxford, or ne hanno studiati, or whatever. Nothing, right? There's no possibility for doing this. Ne hanno lavorato molti. You can't do that. You can't do any of these things with any of the cases where you get avere. That's the key thing, right? Where you have avere as the auxiliary, and it's intransitive, right? You cannot put the ne on the verb and get this phenomenon. So it's restricted to a certain class of things, and the class of things where it works is the class of things where you get essere on the intransitive verb. So you can have, you don't have to put it. Here's something that you can do. You can keep another kind of cool thing, right? You can keep the subject in the object slot, and then when you do that, you have the auxiliary be, and it's fine to say ne sono affondate due, right? And ne sono morti tanti, and so forth, right? So you get the possibility of, so here we have intransitive verbs that only some of which can have the ne, going with the subject at some level, the thing that creates verb agreement. And that can always be in post-verbal position, right? But you only can have the ne on a certain set of the intransitive ones, and that's exactly the same set as the intransitive ones that take essere. So you get a bunch of the same thing when you have these ones that have the so-called reflexive version, or anti-causative is what you might look at that as being, right? Then you get the ne, it's possible to do that. So this phenomenon is known as unaccusativity for whatever reason, right? So this is the unaccusative construction. The unaccusative construction is an intransitive in which you have an intransitive in which you have the thing controlling verb agreement being the object underlyingly. And then also, because of that, having a thematic role like theme and not agent, and not experiencer, and so forth. So we go back here to agli studenti è piaciuta la musica. The students liked the music. To the students, literally, is liked the music. And the verb, note the verb is agreeing with musica. The past participle is in the feminine form. A on the past participle, a on music. And the agreement is singular. The verb is agreeing with music and so forth, right? And it's fine to put ne on here as well, right? So they liked many of them, right? Where ne goes on the verb. So it's systematic, right? The ne will go on the verb only and it doesn't even matter that this is semantically transitive with two arguments, right? That's not even relevant. All that's relevant is that you can put ne on the auxiliary.